Hello, everyone. Welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss of the Center for American Progress. I'm joined by David Gartenstein-Ross of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. David, welcome.
Matt, it's always great to chat with you.
You're now a regular on Blogging Heads, so it's good, as always, to talk with you. We're going to start yesterday. President Obama made a surprise trip to Afghanistan to mark the signing of a long-term partnership agreement between the United States and Afghanistan. What were your impressions of the speech, David?
My main impressions were looking at it through a political lens, for better or worse. But obviously, it came right on the end of the Osama bin Laden anniversary, the ad, which was so controversial. And I think that that's not coincidental, because I think that the Romney campaign on national security issues is very much on its back foot right now. I think that Obama, despite the various Republican objections that I'm sure we're going to discuss, really kind of won that exchange. And so what Obama was speaking to was a couple of audiences. On the one hand, he doesn't want to be outflanked to his right by Romney. So he made the point that we're fighting al-Qaeda, we're here to win. On the other hand, he recognizes that there are people who are going to argue that we need to get out sooner. So he was very much positioning this, I think, vis-a-vis the 2012 elections, in addition to the importance of the long-term planning within Afghanistan. And as a political move, at least, I think it was a rather brilliant move.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. You got a number of things there. I mean, one is I think the majority of Americans who want to be out of Afghanistan.
Right.
But at the same time, there is, within the foreign policy establishment, there is still, a lot of support for, staying there, however you define that, finishing the job. And so you're right, he obviously feels the need to protect himself on that. Going to the anniversary of the killing of Osama bin Laden, the ad that the Obama campaign put out, marking this and asking the question of would Mitt Romney have done the same thing. President Obama has gotten some criticism from that. What do you make of it?
I think the criticism is pretty fair. If the tables were turned, I have no doubt that the Republicans would be using the ad to hammer the Democratic vote, because we saw Republicans do that very thing, not only in the 2004 elections, but also in the 2002 elections. But in the 2002 and 2004 elections, Democrats cried foul. I think that one of the most persuasive ways of putting this forward was Tom Daschle back in 2002, when he argued that national security should not be politicized. We shouldn't make this a partisan issue. We should both be in this to defeat al-Qaeda. And I think that he was right then. But if you look at the 2002, 04, and 06 elections, which the Democrats, of course, won, national security was a major political issue in all of the elections. And all of the winners politicized national security in different ways in those elections. I think it's unhealthy. And a number of commentators have rightly pointed out Republican hypocrisy on this point, which I think is accurate. But at the same time, I think that there is something unhealthy about it.
Right. I mean, this whole idea of we shouldn't politicize national security, I agree and disagree. I mean, on the one hand, it's politics. We disagree about various policies, and so we're going to argue about national security, but I think there's definitely a way to do that without cheapening the whole thing, without, attacks that are, I guess, sort of below the belt. Where that line is, who knows? We have to call it when I guess we know it when we see it. But I would make a distinction here between, I think if I remember correctly, what Daschle was talking about, and kind of the broader argument that you saw a lot of conservatives or Republicans making against Democrats, immediately post 9/11 and in 2004, as kind of a broader critique of, the Democrats won't keep us safe. The Democrats, they're siding with our critics. They're siding with the enemies of America. And what I think is a much more specific critique of Obama toward Mitt Romney, using things that Mitt Romney has himself said, kind of diminishing the importance of Osama bin Laden, saying, he's just one guy, he doesn't mean all that much. And so while I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the chest beating in general, and especially when Democrats do it, but I do think that's a fair critique. Mitt Romney has in fact said things that raise questions, of how vigorously he would have pursued Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, I largely agree with what you said. Even though parts of it cut against my initial statement. I agree with you for one thing that obviously where there are policy disagreements on national security, those are fair game, just as all policy disagreements are fair game. When Daschle put his statement forward about how this really shouldn't be politicized, it was specifically over a policy disagreement, actually. It wasn't the general tone of Democrats are siding with the enemy, but rather it was over a disagreement over unionization within DHS. The Bush administration, the Democrats had very different views, and the Bush administration came out with an attack arguing that the Democrats were slowing down this department that's so important for protecting the country. Again, it gets into kind of the issue where, is this fair game? Is it not fair game? Overall, I'm uncomfortable with the way national security has gotten politicized in so many ways. I mean, I think the Republican convention in 2004 was the very height of that practice, and the constant invocation of 9/11. Giuliani's speech, which invoked 9/11 and Al Qaeda, I think 37 different times in a very short speech. When I look back to that period, I see Democrats raising very similar objections to what Republicans are raising today. Although then it was a much more central issue. It's much more marginal now, but I think the issue of principle is the real interesting issue, and not so much hypocrisy, which I can find plenty of on both sides.
Right. I mean, I remember now the issue of the DH, and not to relitigate that, but I mean, I think the question of politicization there is actually a real one, because if I remember correctly, I mean, this was in large part, the Republicans using a national security issue to grind a usual anti-union axe. I don't know if it's been long enough ago that, I mean, maybe we don't want to even get into it. But, I think the hypocrisy issue, sometimes these issues are tiresome, but yes, let's just recognize for the record that if this was a Republican president, I think someone made the remark yesterday that if this was George W. Bush, he would have been skydiving out of a transport plane surrounded by bald eagles and fireworks. So
in fairness, I don't think there would have been fireworks.
But there would have been a huge show about this. So it is really hilarious to see Karl Rove going on TV and writing articles criticizing anyone.
I agree with that.
Overplaying.
There would have been an enormous show about that, and the Democrats would have said, this is utterly inappropriate. You shouldn't make this into a campaign issue. We wanted to see bin Laden dead as well. So you can see both sides really, in my view, very much lack principle on this. I mean, I think what we can agree on is that the fact. Look, I agree that Obama's decision to carry this out was in fact a gutsy call because and that term has been so mocked. But in the past, you had different raids that could have gone into Pakistan. Which were called off by Bush administration officials. That's something that happened during the course of the Bush administration. Obama talked on the campaign trail and was actually lambasted by some conservatives about this, about how he would go in and use military force in Pakistan if necessary. You'll remember that some conservatives said, Obama's saying that he's going to invade Pakistan, which of course he wasn't saying. His remarks were very much...
John McCain, this was a major line of attack for John McCain. He's going to invade our ally Pakistan?
Right. And what it really was doing was he was very much presaging the raid which ended up getting Osama bin Laden. So I do think that at the end of the day, using this to solidify his national security, foreign policy bona fides, that's something which I see as appropriate. And I think that that's something that a Republican would do. I think it's something that anybody would do. To use this issue to say, look, I'm serious. When it comes to tough calls that will protect the American public, I'm going to make the right call. I think that that's an entirely appropriate campaign theme. I think that where you get the second line of attack, which is, would Romney have done the same, which they used Bill Clinton for in this instance, that's something where the Democrats would also cry foul. If you had just a Republican ad, say George W. Bush or McCain or whomever, if they were the ones who'd gotten bin Laden, and they had an ad just praising themselves without taking that extra step and saying, would John Kerry kill Osama bin Laden? Then you also probably wouldn't have had a very strong Democratic attack. So I feel like part of it was appropriate, part of it was over a line where you'd have both sides objecting. Overall, it's not the biggest injustice in the world. As Michael Cohen pointed out in Foreign Policy, this has been a campaign full of faux outrage. And this is just another one of many faux outrages. But I think that the issue is legitimate of to what extent do we politicize foreign policy? To what extent is it harmful to do so when both sides basically agree on something like, getting bin Laden was a good thing?
Right. I mean, getting back to the gutsy call, I think Jim Fallows wrote a really good piece yesterday responding to Romney's kind of offhand comment. Even Carter would have made this decision, noting that, well, yes, Carter did in fact make a decision like this that went horribly wrong.
Right.
When he ordered the rescue attempt of the hostages in Iran, and he suffered consequences. And so faced with a similar decision that could have gone horribly wrong, they weren't absolutely sure it was bin Laden in the compound. They made the call to go for it, and it worked.
Right.
So, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the president
I think that's exactly right. The Carter quip was a quip that when you actually logically break it down, it's a quip that utterly failed. Because Carter, above all else, illustrates the dangers of giving the green light to something like this, given just how badly Carter's raid failed. Yeah.
No, and it does. It indicates to me, either there's the part of it where Carter has just come to mean Carter just means weakness. There's actually, it's unmoored from any kind of historical context or anything. It's kind of like how people use the term Munich to mean appeasement when they can't really tell you what actually happened at Munich. People just kind of throw the term Carter around to mean weakness. No, but in this circumstance, it really showed that for Romney to say something like that says to me that, perhaps he hasn't actually spent that much time learning about the circumstances surrounding the decision to go after bin Laden. And I find that kind of odd and troubling.
Yeah, I think Carter has come to mean weakness just in the same way that in 2008 Bush meant bad.
Right. Yeah. And Bush, it still does. I mean, Democrats, if these are the rules of the game, then Democrats can continue to refer to Bush in that way for many, many years.
Yeah, I think it'll be less so in this campaign cycle, though, because at the end of the day, one thing Obama has been blasted for is continuing to run against Bush. And he said himself that at some point he has responsibility for the shape that the country's in. I think that he's very aware of that. So I would expect that during this campaign there'll actually be far less invocation of the word Bush than there was back in 2008.
Right. I think by the official campaign that would be right. But in terms of kind of a general, we've got the Carter model that, even if it's unfair to Carter himself, is kind of like a shorthand for a number of things that Republicans ding Democrats on all the time. I would not be surprised if we see the George W. Bush model rising up in a similar way.
Right.
As kind of a long-term kind of political shorthand for, that kind of Republican, that kind of politician, that kind of leader.
Yeah, I'd certainly imagine that will be the case.
Moving on, a year after the death of Osama bin Laden, where do you see Al-Qaeda right now?
So I was looking at this yesterday and last night, and thinking about how would I tabulate the last year for Al-Qaeda, and it's really a very mixed bag when you start to break it down. But I'd say overall the last year has been a very bad year for Al-Qaeda when you look at it, with some notable successes. But to me, the two key things. And then we can talk about peripherals later, but just the two key things, I think, are the core in Pakistan and Somalia. And in Pakistan, obviously you had not only bin Laden killed, but a number of top leaders thereafter were killed in drone strikes. That's the kind of thing which degrades the organization. I think Al-Qaeda is fairly resilient, but their core is certainly worse off right now than it was a year ago. And to me, the core is very important to the overall organization because it's what drives the global vision as opposed to a regional focus. And the second thing is Somalia. And the reason why Somalia, I think, is so important is because it's the area where an Al-Qaeda-linked group has been able to control territory for the longest. And over the course of the past year...
And this is Al-Shabaab.
Yeah, this is Shabaab, which just in February officially merged into Al-Qaeda. After quite some time of having a flirtatious relationship. But Shabaab they lost territory to African Union forces in AMISOM, which is the African Union mission to Somalia. They also woefully mishandled a drought that hit the Horn of Africa, which some say is the worst drought in this region in 60 years. They'd kicked out 8 organizations previously for a variety of reasons that somewhat contradict, such as spreading secularism and spreading Christianity. And so in areas that Shabab controlled within Somalia, you actually had the drought deepen into a famine. A large number of people were leaving Shabab areas, going to refugee camps in Kenya, in Ethiopia, and this gave lie to Shabab's overall posture that they're able to provide governance, provide services, and the like. Both of those, I think, were very bad for al-Qaeda as a global organization. They had successes elsewhere, but I'd say that they were stronger by quite a bit a year ago than they are today.
How about in Yemen?
Yemen obviously was a good time. It was a good year for Al Qaeda. I mean, they've been able to control territory there. The question, as my colleague Will McCants has pointed out in a recent foreign policy piece, is whether they'll be able to control territory in the long term. But certainly the fact that they were able to make the gains that they have in Zinjibar and elsewhere is a matter of concern. They've been able to launch massive, devastating attacks against Yemeni forces. This could end up being very bad. To me, overall, that doesn't overcome their losses in Pakistan and Somalia. And as I said, Somalia I rank as just a little bit more important, not because it's more important geographically. I think Yemen is more important geographically. But I think Somalia is a little bit more important because it gives us a little bit of a clue on the critical question of, can al-Qaeda affiliates maintain their territorial gains? And over the past year, we've seen setbacks in that regard, which doesn't necessarily portend well for al-Qaeda in Yemen. That being said, Yemen is beset by multiple crises. It's running out of water, it's running out of oil, and you have huge unemployment, a youth bulge. Basically, everything that could go wrong is going wrong in Yemen, which will make it very difficult to completely marginalize al-Qaeda. I think that even if they're weakened, which they may or may not be, there'll be a force there for some time to come.
So, and what do you make of the rumors / news of increasing al-Qaeda influence in the Syrian insurgency uprising, whatever we're going to call it?
It's a little bit difficult to really assess that. I find them plausible, but plausible is different than something being true. You have, when you look at al-Qaeda gains, or gains by people with an al-Qaeda-ist type ideology, there have been a lot of those over the course of the past year. The Sinai groups that we've seen arise, many say have an al-Qaeda-ist ideology. I find those reports to be credible. In Nigeria, not only has Boko Haram said that it has a global vision, but also one thing that the U.S. learned from the Abbottabad documents was that bin Laden, before his death, had been in touch with Boko Haram. Something that doesn't make them identical to al-Qaeda by any means, but they are at least ideologically a fellow traveler. One thing that should be overlaid with all of this is that a lot of these conflicts have not only global dimensions, but also very regional dimensions. So, so our viewers shouldn't be confused that I'm saying that all these groups are al-Qaeda. But a lot of these are al-Qaeda-ist groups. They at least claim the ideology, though one can really parse this in multiple ways. But Boko Haram, the last year, has also shown increasing Boko Haram capabilities. Al-Qaeda seems to have gained not only in Mali, following the actions that we've seen there, but also seems to have gained Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb from the developments in Libya, being able to seize weaponry and the like. So they've made a number of gains globally. That's why I say I think it's a very mixed bag. But the areas that I think are most important are areas where things have gone poorly. The other thing is that if you look at certain theaters where al-Qaeda or fellow travelers, at least ideologically, have been active, a lot of them, while they may have gained in the past year, al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example, has shown that it's capable of still carrying out massive attacks. They're far from their peak. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example, was far stronger in the 2005 to 2007 period than it is today, even though it showed that it's still alive. Likewise, if you look at the Caucasus, it seems like if you go back to 2006, before the death of Shamil Basayev, the Caucasus group, which is now called the Caucasus Emirate, was a bit stronger then. So that's other good news about Al-Qaeda. Now, obviously, when I came out with my book last year, it was a somewhat pessimistic take on the first 10 years of the war on terror, in part because I wanted to assess where we were. And one thing I always made clear in interviews is that, yes, the U.S. does have a learning curve. I think that we are getting better. We're not just blindly stumbling around. But there were a lot of early mistakes, including some of the ways we set up our homeland security, also the Iraq War, which was a very costly error on the U.S.'s part that really make the first 10 years not look very good from the U.S.'s perspective. Yeah. But that doesn't mean things are always going to go poorly. And I think overall, while the last year was a mixed bag, it was not a good year for Al-Qaeda.
So that distinction between Al-Qaeda as a series of groups with kind of allegiance to this ideology versus the appeal of the ideology itself. David Ignatius wrote a piece on Sunday looking at the Arab Spring and suggesting that a year after bin Laden's death, his ideology was doing pretty well because of the Arab Spring and because of how it had toppled a number of pro-Western dictators. Now, I thought I had some real criticisms of the piece. I was surprised at Ignatius for saying some of this, because it seemed to me to really buy into a sort of simplistic binary, the West versus Islam framing that I think a lot of Muslim extremists, certainly bin Laden, have promulgated and pushed, but a lot of, I think, conservative, more hawkish elements in the West have also done their part to promote this idea of the West at war with Islam, or if not at war with Islam, that there's intrinsic sort of historic hostility between these two camps. So I was really disappointed in the piece, because it seems to me that the Arab Spring, while obviously chaos always provides an opportunity for elements like Al-Qaeda to come in and try to gain influence and exploit chaos and disorder. What we've seen in the Arab Spring are not, it's not, people are showing that they want a third choice. They reject this, choose A or B, choose A, the West, or B, Al-Qaeda. They want something that's their own. They want a responsible government with economic opportunity that represents their sort of own values and system. It's a long process, but it seems at the very least that they've rejected this this binary choice. Would you agree?
I have mixed feelings about the Ignatius piece. I largely agree with your critique. I think it was a very sloppy piece, which frames. It was basically looking at Al-Qaeda's political agenda and concluding that if parts of the political agenda are echoed within the new political environment of the Arab Spring, then that's a victory for bin Laden. Right. I don't think that that's entirely accurate in any way, shape, or form. The major problem with it is that if certain sentiments that Al-Qaeda had been able to tap into and feed off of for recruiting purposes are now being subsumed in electoral politics, then that could very well actually be bad for Al-Qaeda, because it gives people a means to express themselves in protest in ways other than supporting a violent group.
Right. That's his term, electoral bin Ladenism, seemed just crazy to me. I mean, it seems to me a pretty clear contradiction in terms. It's like vegetarian barbecue.
I mean, one interesting thing that is occurring with it amongst Salafi jihadi types is this kind of below the surface debate about electoral politics, because not just for let me take a step back and actually explain terms for just a second. Salafism is a reference to return to what adherents see as an original form of Islam. There are multiple kinds of Salafism, including quietist Salafism, which tends to be apolitical, then there are more extreme forms of Salafism which seek political power. I use the term jihadi because it's an organic term for people within the movement. So amongst Salafi jihadi scholars, there's this debate about electoral politics, which normally most Salafis, not just Salafi jihadis, see as being something to be avoided because essentially by giving power to the ballot, you're giving power to man over God. Thus, many of them see this as being essentially polytheism. And this debate is actually, I think, a good thing. If you have some representation that makes people think an electoral system can be a good means of expressing themselves, then it could peel people away from the violent movements that have persisted. Now, here, I said before I had mixed feelings about the Ignatius column, and let me explain my mixed feelings, because we both agree on the sloppiness of the column. But the other side of it is, let's say in the U.S., let's take two movements. Let's take the pro-life movement, and we'll call them the religious right, and the libertarian movement. And let's say that pro-life libertarians end up becoming a huge electoral force in 2016. They're winning. Let's say a pro-life libertarian wins the presidency. Now, people would say this has been really good for the religious right. Now, pro-life libertarians are not the religious right, but the fact that both would share some political goals might, in fact, make a sweep into office by pro-life libertarians a good thing for the religious right. So I think that they're below the top line sloppiness of the Ignatius piece. There may be something much more to the argument. It's underdeveloped, but I'm not going to say that the argument is wrong. That perhaps Al Qaeda gains by having people within electoral politics that strongly support certain aspects of its foreign policy. Like I said, totally underdeveloped, such that I'm not going to sign off on it. But I think that there may be kind of a more mature argument within that rather sloppy column.
No, I think that's right, but I think you would have to say go back farther than Bin Laden. I mean, I think you can make a case for, electoral kutubism, but I think Bin Laden was so explicit about his rejection of elections and democracy as a corrupting Western import that it's very hard for me to reconcile, participation in nonviolent electoral politics with anything that could be called Bin Ladenism.
I mean, yes and no, right? If you look at the An-Noor party in Egypt, that's a pretty extreme party. The Zumar brothers, who are part of that party, made a point of inviting Zawahiri to return to Egypt. And this is somewhat of an expression of support. If a group supports, say 90% of Al-Qaeda's goals, and I'm not saying that the An-Noor party does, to be clear, but if a group supports, say, 90% of Al-Qaeda's goals through electoral means, and for An-Noor, a number of politicians within the party have talked about democracy as basically being a transitional step towards a state that is based upon religious law, towards a Sharia state. In that case, maybe it makes sense as a term. I mean, clearly, you and I agree, and everyone must, that Bin Laden rejected democratic mechanisms. There's no two ways about that. He clearly did. But it's not necessarily a contradiction, but I think it's being bandied about in a way that's so sloppy as to make it a non-argument. It could be, and overall, I mean, the other thing I'd say is I actually don't like the term. Even despite my tepid defense of it, I don't like it as a term, not really because it's a contradiction in terms, but more because another aspect of Bin Ladenism that makes it so important and so threatening to the West was its embrace of violence in defense of its ultimate goals. And the fact that these groups are at least using the electoral system, that's an embrace of nonviolent, using the ballot. Now, ultimately, someone could both be violent and also use nonviolent electoral politics. That's something that we've seen in multiple instances. I mean, a good example here in the United States is the Ku Klux Klan during its heyday in the early part of the 20th century, when it both used very violent measures and also was an electoral force in and of itself. So they're not inconsistent, but the use of electoral process does separate them from
I think the Sadrists in Iraq are a great example of this as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, not a very good column, but it would be interesting to see a more thorough and more rigorous look at that particular problem set.
Right. Moving on, Richard Grenell, formerly a spokesman for the Bush administration at the United Nations, had come onto the Romney campaign as a foreign policy national security spokesman, tendered his resignation from the campaign yesterday. First reported by Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post. The reason given was pressure from from Republicans over the fact that Grenell is an out and proud gay man. I think this is really unfortunate, to say the very least. I think I'm not sure yet whether I don't think we have the whole story. I'll just say that, but it seems clear that the Romney campaign was getting pressure on that issue. What's your take?
I agree. I think that this is very unfortunate. I mean, you have two different threads of argument. One is his tweets that were criticizing different women who shouldn't be wearing backless dresses, things like that. Some very kind of crude tweets. He deleted about 800 of them. But that hasn't really come up as being the reason that he left the campaign. Overall, I think that's something that he would survive, and it wasn't the kind of controversy that normally would sink someone. So I think that it is really due to the fact that it's due to the fact that he was gay. I think more than the fact that he was out and open about being gay. The critiques that I've seen on the right, and you can see them in National Review, Matthew Frank has a piece on this. There are critiques of him for being an advocate of gay marriage. Now, I find this to be a very unfortunate position, because his position on gay marriage was unrelated to what he would be doing for the campaign as a spokesman on national security and foreign policy issues. Now, that's not to say that any time there's an unrelated issue, it's going to be of no consequence. Someone being, say, a 9/11 truther, a Holocaust denier, or whatever, that's the kind of thing that would justifiably cause a controversy, even if they were only there as, say, a Health and Human Services spokesman. But in this case, it brings up the question of, can the Republican Party tolerate somebody who's an advocate of gay marriage? And to me, regardless of one's view of gay marriage, I think that the answer is yes, one can tolerate it. And that I think that there's a perfectly good conservative position advocating for gay marriage. Andrew Sullivan, for example, who had a book on this several years back that he edited, has, I think, made the case that there is a conservative case based upon values of individual autonomy, non-interference from the state for gay marriage. So to say that it's this is the kind of thing that should make him be cast out of the campaign as a foreign policy national security spokesman is akin to saying that there's no place for that argument within the Republican Party, and I disagree with that categorically.
Right. It makes me wonder, what if there was something else going on. I mean, just getting back quickly to the tweets. Yes, he had gotten criticism for some of those. As someone myself who's gotten some criticism for things I've tweeted, I have a little bit of sympathy here. I wasn't a fan of those comments, but I recognize that, sometimes there are certain lines of humor that don't come across so well, or if someone is inclined to criticize you, to interpret them in the most negative possible way. But, I appreciate the way that Grenell engages on Twitter. I've mixed it up with him a few times over some things. We disagreed. We had what I thought was a very good and productive exchange. I think this is really regrettable, and it does speak to, I'm not sure how to put this. It speaks to, a Republican Party, or at least a constituency within the Republican Party that cannot countenance someone like this, who's by all accounts very effective in his particular issue area, if he carries around a difference of opinion on certain, a basket of key social issues.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that ultimately, it seems my guess is that the Republican Party, at some point, whether it's 2016, 2020, will change on that issue. In part, if you look at the polling of young people, including young conservatives, they're less socially conservative than older Republicans. Mm-hmm. Now, conservatives can debate out whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think that will change. And to me, at the very least, this issue of gay marriage, this position on it, is not one that shocks the conscience. In fact, if you're I will say, if you're a gay conservative, almost certainly you'd be for gay marriage. Marriage is something that, obviously marriage is not a political institution in and of itself, right? Being married doesn't mean that you're conservative or liberal, obviously. But it does align with many, conservative values of, family, this kind of, being part of a community within a loving, faithful relationship. These are things that conservatives in general embrace. And if you're a gay conservative, you're probably going to want to be able to express yourself in these ways in the same way as other conservatives. So the fact that he is a gay marriage advocate as a conservative makes perfect sense to me. But also, as we said, it's unrelated to what he would have been doing for the campaign. So the question becomes, is his position on gay marriage the kind of thing that shocks the conscience so much that he should be cast out of the campaign, even though his duties have nothing to do with domestic issues? And I think the answer is, to me, absolutely does not shock the conscience in that way. I agree with you. It is regrettable that he was cast out of the campaign like this.
So I guess we'll be ending this discussion on a note of agreement. Thanks very much, David. Enjoyed it as always, and I will look forward to the next time.
Absolutely, Matt. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.